It has been known that since the 19th century, sea levels around the globe have been rising. Throughout the 20th and especially the 21st century, however, it's become clear that this trend of increase has been exponential. Since the year 1880, average sea levels have risen by 21 to 24 centimetres, with half of this growth occurring since 1993. With these facts being evident, it poses serious questions to how and why this is happening, and in particular, what the environmental, social and economic ramifications of continued sea levels are for communities and nations around the globe. So, what is the extent of this issue and what exactly is causing the increase in sea levels? Well, there are three ways that this can occur: thermal expansion, the melting of ice caps and ice glaciers, and the degradation of the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets. Sea level rise presents a multitude of social, economic, and environmental impacts that are being felt on local, national, and global scales around the world. The influence of sea level rise and its social consequences can be felt and demonstrated even in the smallest of communities. Take the small suburb of Lewisham, for example, located 30 minutes away from Tasmania's state capital, Hobart. Like many other places in this region of Tasmania, this community, just shy of 800 residents, has been constantly dealing with coastal erosion for several years now. Lewisham's foreshore has been continually degraded, with several trees falling down and a walkway at risk of collapse. While the erosion has only occurred in Crown land so far, continued encroachment and coastal degradation poses a serious threat to local properties. Under worsening climate scenarios, residents will be forced to relocate and leave behind familiar communities. This in turn would cause heightened financial and mental stress, and the erosion of a sense of community. Lewisham also has a population that is more at risk of the effects of climate events, with a median age 2 years higher than the state average. The issue of coastal erosion as a result of sea level rise has also been a cause of tension between the local community and the state government. Frustrations have been expressed at a perceived lack of action and initiative from Tasmania's National Parks Authority and Tasmania's major political parties to address their concerns. For instance, the original tea tree fence barrier that was put into place to protect the 30-metre wide foreshore has fallen into disrepair, as the same foreshore is currently only 8 metres from properties in some areas. We examined the consequence of sea level rise in a localised context, but to better understand another major impact of sea level rise, we can look at the Southeast Asian country of Indonesia. As the world's largest archipelagic nation with over 17,000 islands and some of the world's most extensive low-lying coastlines, Indonesia's geography makes it highly vulnerable to sea level rise. Projections indicate that by 2100, at least 115 Indonesian islands could be underwater due to a combination of rising sea levels and land subsidence. Up to 92 of Indonesia's outermost islands are at risk of sinking. By 2050, thousands of small islands and millions of coastal homes could be lost to the sea. Around 60% of Indonesia's population lives along the coast, placing tens of millions at risk of displacement due to flooding, erosion, and permanent inundation. Urban centres, especially the nation's capital of Jakarta, where about 40% lies below sea level, are especially at risk. Parts of Jakarta experience chronic flooding, and a third of the city could be submerged by 2050. This issue is one of the main driving factors behind the Indonesian government's decision to construct a new capital city on the island of Borneo. In cities like Pekalongan in central Java, tidal flooding has already submerged large urban and agricultural areas, in addition to altering the shape of coastlines, with sea levels rising in these cities by an average of 3 to 5 centimetres per year. These rising seas and changing coastlines are destroying crucial habitats such as mangroves, wetlands and beaches. This diminishes coastal defences against storms and erodes critical nursery grounds for fish and other wildlife. This encroachment also brings saltwater intrusion, which is contaminating freshwater supplies and soils, killing trees and crops and reducing biodiversity in vulnerable ecosystems. Saltwater intrusion is also damaging rice paddies, coconut plantations and other agricultural land, reducing harvests and threatening food security in rural communities. Also, coastal and nearshore fisheries are threatened by habitat degradation and reduced water quality. As a result, many fishery-dependent communities face declining harvests and increased economic hardship. Sea level rise enhances the destructive impact of storm surges and heavy rainfall, worsening erosion, flooding, and infrastructure damage. As islands in the archipelago disappear, Indonesia could face challenges to its status as an archipelagic nation, with potential ramifications for maritime boundaries and resource rights. This is because the loss of islands within the nation's archipelago erodes its jurisdiction and claims on waters in between these islands according to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. The less islands they have in their archipelago, the more likely it would be that they lose their status as an archipelagic nation. Collectively, these impacts threaten not only Indonesia's environment and economy, but also the security, livelihoods, and well-being of its people. The impacts of rising sea levels in Indonesia underscores and demonstrates the urgent need for both adaptation and global measures to address climate change. Sea level rise generates significant economic impacts due to how it can damage infrastructure, property, and productive land. This in turn increases the investments required for coastal protection. This aspect is especially relevant on a global scale, as the potential damage to economically vital port cities around the world on every continent becomes clear. Economic trade hubs in more developed countries and newly industrializing countries such as Shanghai in China, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, Singapore, Los Angeles in the US, and Lagos in Nigeria are all at risk. But the impacts of sea level rise to similar trade hubs in less developed nations will be more detrimental to those nations that have jurisdiction in these areas, and their neighbours as well. Take the small East African nation of Djibouti, for example, which borders the nations of Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. Its location makes it an important economic hub for the region, and its economic reliance on port infrastructure in Djibouti City have made it especially vulnerable to sea level rise. The port is critical for trade for every nation in the Horn of Africa. By 2050, under a hot climate scenario, the small nation could face a permanent loss of 6% of its GDP due to damage to coastal infrastructure, the disruption of transport, and flooding. Increased intensity in weather events has already strained roads, railways, and port infrastructure in the region, but sea level rise will add tens of millions in losses from coastal damage. Other economic impacts to the nation include a general loss of labour productivity, with an estimated 2 to 3.5% reduction as a result of climate-induced events. Urban flooding in Djibouti City already causes up to $43 million in damage per event, with annual climate-related flood damages to increase by another $10 million. An increase in sea levels alone may cause around $38 million in losses annually per year by 2050. While this will have major ramifications for the economy of Djibouti, it will have more detrimental effects on Ethiopia's economy. Because as a landlocked nation, 95% of Ethiopia's imports are handled via Djibouti. This makes the integrity of Djibouti's ports critical for the region's economic and practical stability. Without major investment in climate adaptation, Djibouti and the wider East African region will suffer further economic downturns and additional socio-cultural disruptions. Overall, Djibouti's coastal economy, trade infrastructure, and urban growth prospects are directly threatened by sea level rise, with consequences for national income, regional economic stability, and long-term development. The nation's economic future depends on major investments in resilience, adaptation, and climate-friendly infrastructure. So with that being said, how are nations around the world aiming to combat the issue of sea level rise? Well, local and national governments, in addition to global organisations, are broadly focused on solutions that aim to mitigate and adapt to climate-induced issues like sea level rise. Mitigation involves addressing the root causes of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This can slow the rate of global warming and in turn, the rate of sea level rise. But mitigation cannot prevent sea level rise that is already locked in by historical emissions. Its benefits are realised over decades or centuries. In the meantime, solutions aiming to adapt to these conditions are implemented. One of the most common adaptation strategies that can be seen in all three of these regions is the construction of seawalls or seawall-like infrastructure. In Lewisham, Tasmania, seawall-style structures have been utilised in an attempt to protect from coastal erosion. The Sorell Council has undertaken several projects to manage stormwater outfalls and to protect Lewisham's beaches from erosion, using interventions like headwalls, improved drainage, and dune protection rather than large seawalls. These works have had local success in reducing beach erosion and managing pollutants, but coastal erosion still remains a risk. It will also be important to ensure consistent funding and support to maintain these structures to prevent a repeat of history. In Indonesia, construction has commenced on a giant seawall along northern Java. This is considered to be a massive project intended to stretch 500 kilometers and with costs exceeding $80 billion. The wall aims to protect major cities from flooding, land subsidence, and tidal surges. However, environmentalists and civil society groups have flagged ecological damage, harm to fishing livelihoods, negative social impacts, and possible disruption of natural coastal dynamics as issues that could be exacerbated by this project. Also, seawalls like this may not address upstream or systemic issues like land subsidence from groundwater extraction. Short-term gains in sustainability are expected, but long-term resilience is uncertain unless this project is complemented by other adaptation and mitigation actions. And, in Djibouti City, while there is major port infrastructure development and coastal reinforcement, seawalls have not solved all problems. Erosion hotspots still persist, and in some places, attempts at land reclamation have exacerbated vulnerabilities in other areas. These interventions have not always adapted dynamically to changing environmental risks either. Sections of coastline remain increasingly vulnerable, even as other areas gain new protection. So, while seawalls and similar hard structures are effective for protecting specific assets and reducing immediate risks, they often carry financial, social, and ecological costs, which end up displacing risks rather than eliminating them. Broadly speaking, it would be best to utilise seawalls as part of a combined approach, one that involves nature-based adaptation, planning, managed retreat, and improved land use to offer broader, more sustainable solutions to ensure long-term resilience. Mitigation remains essential to slow the underlying cause of sea level rise, while adaptation buys time and reduces harm, but does not alone resolve the crisis.